You're listening to Bottomshelf Bitcoin. This is episode 32.
Relax. Enjoy your coffee. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Take a chill pill. What is it? Okay.
Hey everybody, welcome back to another episode of Bottomshelf Bitcoin, the podcast that puts Bitcoin knowledge within everyone's reach. As always, I'm your host, Josh Humphrey, and today my guest is Vijay Boyapati, author of The Bullish Case for Bitcoin. Vijay, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Josh. It's great to talk to you. And I hope your listeners will forgive me. I have a cold, so I'm going to sound a little bit funny.
That's all right. I am saying your name. Am I saying your name correctly, or did
you said it really well? You said it better than I can say it. I say my name with an Australian accent, so I kind of butcher my own name. But you actually did a really good job.
Cool. All right. So yeah, I mean you wrote Bullish Case for Bitcoin. It's been a while now. And then, well, actually, before we get into that, I don't know why I do this out of order sometimes. Can you kind of give us a little bit of your background and then kind of how you got into Bitcoin?
Yeah, sure. So I'm Australian. You can probably hear that in my accent. I came to the United States in 2000, so almost 20 years ago, to do a PhD in computer science, and I ended up taking a job offer instead. This was back in the huge .com boom and bust that happened back then, and I eventually settled at Google. I got a job at Google, and I was there for several years. I left Google, and then I went and campaigned in the 2008 presidential election for Ron Paul. And did a bunch of other stuff, various startups I worked for since then. But how I got into Bitcoin, it was in 2011. I had a bet with a friend of mine who I used to work with at Google about what the Federal Reserve would do at their next policy meeting. And the bet was for a single silver eagle, which at the time was worth $50. And I won the bet, and so I said, can I have my silver eagle? And my friend said, well, instead of giving you a silver eagle, how about I give you this thing called Bitcoin? And I was like, what's that? I don't even know what that is. And he kind of explained that it was this new kind of money, and my friend is really brilliant, one of the best investors I know. So I was like, okay, fine, I'll take that instead of the silver eagle. And so I had to. This was 2011, so there weren't really good wallets or explorers or anything like that. This is before Coinbase and most of the websites people know about. And so I had to download the core software and run it, and it began downloading the blockchain, and it took several hours. And I was like, what on earth is this? Like, why do I need to do all of this to get these Bitcoins? So I didn't really know what was going on. And my friend transferred the Bitcoins to an address on my wallet, and he showed me on a very primitive block explorer. He said, look, here are the Bitcoins that I sent you. And it's just a string of numbers and letters. And I was like, what the hell is this? But that sparked my interest, and I did a bunch of reading, like most people who do when they go down the rabbit hole, and I pretty quickly understood Bitcoin as a monetary phenomena. And I'd been interested in Austrian economics for a long time, and I think that gave me the tools to understand what Bitcoin was about. And there was a whole bunch of interesting debates around Bitcoin at the time, like whether or not it was a monetary good, whether it could be money, whether it satisfied Ludwig von Mises's regression theorem or not. And so, I didn't invest in Bitcoin for a while, but I was absolutely fascinated with what it was from an economics point of view.
Okay, well then I'm going to ask a question I wasn't planning on asking, but so then I forgot that you had worked for Ron Paul. do you, and I'm assuming then you know maybe some people over at Mises or something like that. Do you feel like there's because I get this kind of feeling that there's this disconnect with the older generation of like Austrian economics people, that they don't really think Bitcoin works because it's intangible.
Yeah, and it's really unfortunate because I think some of the people at the Mises Institute are absolutely brilliant, but
Yeah, for sure.
they have missed, in my opinion, misunderstood the two most important monetary phenomena in the last decade. They in my opinion, incorrectly understood the effects of the Fed's policy in 2008, and most of them predicted hyperinflation. And I wrote a long paper on why I thought there would not be hyperinflation. Instead, we'd see something closer to mild deflation. And then they also, I think, really misunderstood Bitcoin. And the shame of it is that they have the right methodology to understand Bitcoin, but they just haven't been able to apply it very well. And perhaps it is an older generation thing where they really associate money with something being tangible and physical, and having so-called intrinsic value. Although it's a little ironic to hear Austrians talk about intrinsic value, people like Peter Schiff, because the Austrian School of Economics teaches that it's the subjective theory of value that's correct. Value is not intrinsic to any object, it's how people perceive it to be valued. That's how it gets its value.
Yeah. Speaking of Peter Schiff, it always frustrates me to see him downing Bitcoin, because I think one of the precursor things for me finding Austrian economics and libertarianism and everything was this video I saw of him going down saying, "I am the 1% to all the Occupy Wall Street people." And that was kind of, pivotal to me. So to see him still just like, poo-pooing on Bitcoin.
It's especially because he seems to understand gold pretty well. And so he has the tools to understand Bitcoin, but he's just misapplying those tools so badly that he's even gone so far as to say it's worse than fiat money, which is absolutely absurd.
Oh man! All right, so getting back on course, then you wrote the Bullish Case for Bitcoin, which is a really great article, I guess, is the best term for it. The length makes I would say it's longer than an essay, but I don't know what the appropriate term is for that. But this really great piece on why you're bullish for Bitcoin. Given the current downturn, I say downturn, the price, the decreased price. So let's say, are you still bullish, or all those things? I kind of have an idea how you're going to answer this, and I have my own thoughts on it. But are you still bullish in the same ways?
Yeah, I am. I'm still very bullish. I'm in this for the long term, so I'm not a trader, and I don't trade in and out of positions. I have the same amount of Bitcoin that I had before this huge spike, and the same amount after the crash as well. So, and in my opinion, this is just a natural cycle in Bitcoin's road to becoming the global reserve currency. And we've seen several of these before. And the thing that's really amazing is how remarkably alike these different hype cycles look. If you take the shape of the hype cycle in 2016 and 17 and the crash, and you superimpose that on the hype cycle in 2013, they're almost identical. In fact, if you superimpose that price structure on the price chart of gold from the 1970s to, say, 2010, it again looks almost identical. And so I sort of speculated that this is an inherent social dynamic to the process of monetization. Nothing can go from being not valued at all having zero value to becoming a global reserve currency in a straight, predictable, linear path. It happens in waves in these hype cycles. And I think these hype cycles honestly have a life of their own. In bear markets, good news doesn't matter, and in bull markets, bad news doesn't matter. So in 2017, I don't know if you remember, there was several pieces of very bad news. At one stage, China banned anything to do with Bitcoin, mining, trading, owning, banned everything. And that seemed really scary. One of the biggest markets on earth is completely shutting Bitcoin down. And the price, temporarily dropped, but it recovered very, very quickly. So my view is these cycles have a life of their own, and external factors really don't matter that much. But another thing I find interesting is how people react to these cycles. And there are, in my opinion, two mindsets during the bear phase of a hype cycle. And one of the mindsets is, how much money have I lost? How many dollars have I lost from my investment? And they say you bought 10 Bitcoins and you paid like, I don't know, $100,000, and now they're only worth like $30,000. So one mindset is like, oh, I've lost $70,000 worth of investment. Another mindset is, how many Bitcoins do I own? What fraction of the total number of Bitcoins do I own? Because the supply is strictly limited to 21 million. And if you change your mindset to the fraction of the total that you own, bear markets are actually a great opportunity. They're a great opportunity to increase your fraction. And if Bitcoin does, as I believe, eventually become the global reserve currency, then you've put yourself at a huge advantage over other people who will be trying to acquire Bitcoin at much, much higher prices. And the last thing I kind of want to say about the price drop is there's a very natural emotional progression that people who are investors go through, and this is true for any asset, not just Bitcoin. The first stage is people feel fear, like, is this really happening? Is it actually a bear market? Because during the bull phase, there are a lot of pullbacks, and each time people are worried that it might be the beginning of the bear market. So when it's first happening, there's fear. And then the next stage is despair, the sense that actually this is really a bear market, and maybe this is going to get bad, and I'm stuck in a position that's down, and who knows how low it's going to go. The next stage after that is disgust, the sense that I made a horrible investment. I hate myself for doing it. I hate Bitcoin. This whole thing, like, who convinced me to get into this? It's really a shame that I was brought into this horrendous market and lost so much money. And then eventually the last stage is capitulation, when people have gone through that feeling of extreme disgust and they think, I've just got to get out of this. I can't deal with this anymore. And that's when the price bottoms, is when people just give up and walk away. And it doesn't mean it's going to come back immediately, but what we've seen from these hype cycles in the past is there's a plateau phase when the price kind of levels off and stays flat for a fairly long period of time. In 2013-14, the market leveled off for almost 2 years. And my opinion is it could be even longer this time, because the bigger Bitcoin gets, the longer these hype cycles will take. Gold went through a hype cycle that was 20 years. And I obviously don't think it's going to take that long for Bitcoin, but it's possible that we are in a bear market for several years. And by that stage, most of the people who got in just for the quick profit will have completely forgotten about Bitcoin. And we'll only start paying attention as it breaks a new high in the next cycle.
Yeah, that's funny when you say forgetting about it. I've met some people in real life, and they say, "Oh, what do you do?" And I kind of tell them, because I have another job aside from this, and this is just kind of a side thing. And I say, oh, you know, and I run a podcast on the side, and it has to do with Bitcoin. And they say, oh, Bitcoin, that's still a thing? Like, I thought that was over. You know, so it's like I forget, you know, when I get in my nice comfy echo chamber, it's like most of the world thinks like it's gone.
Yeah. Well, there's also an interesting idea that one of my friends told me about, that certain people need to hear about something many, many times before they'll take it seriously. And for the average person who isn't already sort of ideologically primed to understand why Bitcoin's important, they might need to hear about it 10 or 20 times before they pay attention. Say, hey, everyone I know seems to be talking about this thing, so maybe I should check it out and maybe I should buy some. For people like you and me, you know, we have maybe a political background where we already understood why it was important, so we didn't need to hear about it so many times before we recognized that this is something that we need to pay attention to. And then there are people who, it doesn't matter how many times they hear about it, they're never ever going to pay attention to it because they're ideologically opposed to it. They're people who believe that the government should control the supply of money and that money should be inflated. And if you believe those things, if you deeply believe those things, you want Bitcoin to fail because it's really challenging your view of the world. So people like Paul Krugman and Nouriel Roubini are just really vitriolic against Bitcoin. At any time it crashes is like a great excuse for them to say, I told you so, even though they've been saying I told you so since about $10. So I find that interesting how different people react when they hear about Bitcoin.
Right. You know, of those two, I don't know which one frustrates me more. Because watching that, I don't know, briefing or whatever you want to call it, where Nouriel was speaking, and it's like most of what he says about all the altcoins is true. And then he starts ragging on Bitcoin. I'm like, but it's different because, and why can you not see that it's different? So I don't know. That's just an aside for me personally.
Yeah. I think of the two Krugmans are much worse, only by the fact that he's much more influential. Nouriel Roubini is really a nobody.
Yeah, that's true.
But Paul Krugman uses the status of having a Nobel Prize in economics, which, you know, is actually not a real Nobel Prize. It's a fake Nobel Prize. It was created by a Swedish bank.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Yep.
Yeah, and then, you know, he's got the New York Times column, so that gives him a platform. Anyway, I was gonna go. So where do you think I've got your bullish case for Bitcoin pulled up here. Where do you think we're at in this? You talk about Gartner hype cycles. Where do you think we're at right now? If you had to guess.
I think we're getting close to entering the plateau phase. I don't know if we've had final capitulation. My guess is, you know, the emotional stages that I talked about earlier. I think we're in the disgust phase. If you just by reading the news and people talking about it, and just the general sense that people are disgusted by the euphoria of the boom. And there was this article in Breaker magazine about the blockchain cruise and just just how gaudy it was, and you know, how they hired women in scantily clad women to keep the people on the boat company. It just sounded really sordid and shady, and so I think that now the media sort of views what's happening in the community with disgust, and so I think there's that general sense that people don't want to be associated with this anymore. So it's not like in the bull phase where everyone was like, "Oh, how do I buy Bitcoin?" And I remember when near the peak of the hype cycle, the nanny for my children, she's an older lady in her 60s, asked how she could buy Ethereum. She didn't even know how to pronounce Ethereum. And I remember it thinking at the time, we're getting very, very close to a top. When my 60-year-old nanny is asking me how she can buy Ethereum.
Yeah.
So yeah, I think we're getting close to capitulation. I don't have a specific price target. Honestly, I'd be surprised if Bitcoin dropped below 2,000. I'd be pretty surprised. But I think probably by the middle of next year we'll be in the sort of plateau phase where the price is leveled off and just stays flat for a while.
Yeah, I talking about disgust and people, it's kind of I'm glad now that I didn't push my family to buy as much as I kind of wanted to last year around the holidays, because it would make these holidays a lot more awkward.
Yeah. I think actually now is the time, sort of counterintuitively, now is the time to be pushing friends and family to try and understand Bitcoin. In the boom phase, you have people coming to you, and I'm sure you had this experience as well. I had family and friends asking me, how do I buy Bitcoin? How much should I buy? Is this now a good time to buy? Should I buy Ethereum? Should I buy Litecoin? All these kind of questions start coming in unasked for. But really, it's now that people should be paying attention, and now that people should be doing their research and looking to build a position in Bitcoin. Probably the best investment strategy that anyone could have had in the last 10 years is just a dollar cost average during Bitcoin bear markets. So just accumulate slowly during the bear phase. And if anyone had done that over the last decade, they would have made a lot of money.
Yeah, for sure. So just real quick, I'm going to kind of go through these things that you hit in your article for the audience. If anybody hasn't read this, I'm obviously going to have links in the show notes. You definitely need to read through this Bullish Case for Bitcoin. When did you put this out? Like the beginning of this past year, right? Like
yeah, I think it was about
March,
February 2018, but I honestly had been writing it for probably 6 or 7 months before that. I like you.
Oh, really?
I have children like you, and I have a day job as well, and so it took a long time. I think I wrote like a sentence or two every day, and as you know, the article is really long. It's I think it's over 10,000 words, and I started writing it when I think the price of Bitcoin was 2,500 on the way up, and
Oh, wow.
and I remember thinking, I'll get this out really quickly. Hopefully, I can get it out before it gets to 3,000. And when I finished it, the bull market had already ended, and we were sort of on the way down. So that was a little sad. I am, to toot my own horn a little bit, I am proud that I kind of thought the bull market would end somewhere between 20 and 50,000. I know that's a big range, but I had specific reasoning, and I wrote that in my article, and people might think, oh, he wrote that because he knew when the bear market ended, but I actually wrote that part several months before the bull market ended, and the reason I gave was that above 20,000, Bitcoin's entire market capitalization would actually be a pretty large fraction of gold's, and gold gets a large fraction of its demand from central banks around the world. And I did not believe that central banks or nation states would participate in this hype cycle. I thought it would be driven mostly by retail demand, and I think that's what happened. I think the next hype cycle, when it happens, will have a much larger component of institutional demand.
Yeah, agreed. So in this article, I really like this graphic here. I mean, obviously go through, you guys read and read all the words too and the explanations, but you have this really nice graphic here, kind of side by side of Bitcoin, gold, and fiat, and ranking, give a letter grade on all these things of these qualities of what makes them a good money: of durable, portable, fungible, verifiable, divisible, scarce, an established history, and censorship resistance. And the only ones that Bitcoin doesn't get an A on here are durable, fungible, and established history. So, and I think established history is not something you can just make happen. It's just got to be time. And then fungible is something that's only keeps improving. So, yeah, I mean, just to kind of agree with you from where I stand, like reading through this again, I don't think any of those things have changed. The fundamentals haven't changed unless they've gotten better. So, I agree with you. I'm a long-term kind of guy. And so I'm still bullish on it, but yeah, it's weird to me, like to see such big price fluctuations. And you're right. I guess that's part of it too. It's just that it's a retail driven thing of speculation.
And
some of that.
I've been paying attention to Bitcoin since 2011, and to me, this doesn't actually seem that bad. If you're around in like 2011 or 2012, there was a crash from like, I think it was $35 or $32 down to like $2. And in percentage terms, that's actually, worse than what we're seeing now. Is quite terrifying. And along the way, these crashes, they've always been people who have said this is the end for Bitcoin and it's not coming back. This was a fad, and it was just for a bunch of internet geeks and libertarians. So that's part of the despair phase, I think, is that the people who were doubters come out from under the closet like cockroaches and start telling you, I told you so, I told you so. And that it really affects people who don't have that sort of long-term view and who don't have ideological conviction in why Bitcoin is important. But if you've been around for a while, if you've been through one or two of these hype cycles, you'll recognize this one's just like the ones in the past.
Yeah, and for me, like, I don't have that multiple cycle viewpoint, because I may have said this on the show before, but so I got in. It was explained to me kind of loosely, probably end of 2013, beginning of 2014, somewhere in there. And so I think I kind of got in and didn't realize these cycles happen. And so I got in just a smidge, like in 2014.
That's great.
And then didn't pay attention.
Great timing.
Well, it would have if I'd really paid attention to it and dug into the tech and everything, because I would have been more convinced and I would have bought a lot more of it.
Yeah.
Hindsight's 2020, obviously. And then it wasn't until last year I started getting these emails from Coinbase and stuff that's like, how we're going to handle the hard fork. And I was like, what is this? So I had to go back and read it and find it, because I'd just not really been paying attention to any of it until that point. So
it's funny because I think everyone says they wish they had bought Bitcoin earlier, but I think the truth is, for the vast majority of people, if they had bought Bitcoin earlier, they would have just sold it earlier as well.
Right.
You can find people on Twitter, like there's this famous tweet from someone in 2011 who said, I can't remember what the exact number was. He was like, I wish I hadn't sold my Bitcoin at 8 cents, because now it's like $1.
Right.
So you had to really be. It doesn't make sense. What my point is, it doesn't make sense to say I wish I had bought earlier. It only makes sense if you had bought earlier and also understood why it was important and why you should hold for a very, very long time. So when people lament that they didn't buy earlier, I'm like, yeah, don't worry about it. You would have sold immediately.
Yeah. So, speaking of the fork, what's your take on the recent Bitcoin Cash? I don't know if you want to call it the fork, the splinter, the civil war, the hash wars that's going on. You seem to take a particular interest in some of this stuff.
Yeah, I mean, I like paying attention to what's happened from these forks away from Bitcoin, because it was unprecedented that the fork in August 2017 that created Bcash had never happened before, and a lot of the scaling debate was about trying to prevent a hard fork from happening and trying to keep the community together. And I honestly, before the fork happened, I really didn't want any kind of split. I thought it would be bad for Bitcoin. I thought it would hurt its network effect. But now my view has changed. In a way, I think it's great for Bitcoin because it purged all the lunatics from the Bitcoin community, the people who didn't understand what Bitcoin was and who tried to control Bitcoin. And now what you have with the splitting of Bcash into two different groups is it's really a war between a small group of egomaniacs. On one side, you have Jihan Wu, who's the CEO of Bitmain, and Roger Ver, who support Bitcoin ABC, their version of Bcash. And on the other side, you have Calvin Ayre and Craig Wright, who support Bcash SV. They call it Satoshi's vision, which is just ludicrous. But it's especially bad for Jihan because Bitmain is sitting on paper losses of hundreds of millions of dollars from the botched trade where they traded their Bitcoins that they had mined in 2016 for Bcash. And this sort of turned up in their IPO filing. They had, when a company files to go public, they have to list their assets and the nature of their business. And it was clear that they had sold all of their Bitcoins for Bcash, and they were sitting on a mountain of Bcash. I think at the time it was worth $1 billion. And the problem for them is they have no ability to sell such a massive position of Bcash. That them buying Bcash was the reason that its market price stayed as high as it did for as long as it did. If they tried to sell, its price would completely collapse to zero. And I think the market has kind of understood this, and now you see Bcash is trading at a tiny fraction of the value of Bitcoin. And Bitmain's financial machinations resemble a failed state that's trying to prop up its currency by selling its foreign currency reserves, which in this case was the Bitcoin that it mined, to maintain a price level for the currency that it was trying to defend, which was Bcash. And so I think they're in a lot of trouble. And it wouldn't surprise me if in 2019 we see the bankruptcy of Bitmain.
Wow. Yeah. I think I'm looking right here. It's like ABC is trading at 0.028 Bitcoin. So it's just, sad for them.
Yeah, it also really destroys the credibility. The good thing about the split away from Bitcoin in 2017, it was a minority split. It was a very small but loud, vocal group of people who wanted to create a version of Bitcoin with bigger blocks, but it was definitely a tiny minority. In the case of the Bcash split, the community is split almost down the middle, and so that's really devastating for people in that community because they're in a state of constant war where they're denigrating each other and the choices that each side has made. And they're potentially going to attack each other. They've threatened 51% attack of each other's chain, and because they're using the same hashing algorithm, they can do that. So they're under constant threat of destruction, and there's really no way to get out of this because both sides don't want to back down. And sort of game theoretically, the SV side has an advantage in that they said that they would 51% attack the ABC chain at any future point in time in history. So basically, ABC can never let down its guard. It can never let its hashing power drop to a fraction of SV because they could potentially get reorg attacks, which means if you have ABC coins, then they could potentially disappear if that chain gets reorganized. So that really harms confidence in that chain and both chains. And so I honestly don't see that either of them can recover from where they are, and I think they're going to slowly fade into complete irrelevance by 2019. It wouldn't surprise me if the total value of both of them is less than 1% of Bitcoin's value.
It's kind of weird. I'm kind of on the one hand, like I'm kind of glad that the original, like you said, when you said it gave an outlet for all those people to kind of go off and do their own thing, and I'm grateful for it because, like I said, if that hadn't have been happening, I probably wouldn't have paid attention and got back in and forced myself to learn the technical side to protect myself. But at the same time, it's kind of sad and frustrating to watch people just do this and feel like they don't get what it was about in the first place.
It's a huge squandering of resources. There are people who could be helping the Bitcoin ecosystem, who could be building software or who could be marketing Bitcoin, and they're wasting their time on these irrelevant shit coins. And to no benefit to anyone. It's not making the world a better place. It's just diverting energy to something that's not going to succeed.
Do you think we'll see anybody come back to Bitcoin development? I mean, I see people say, "Oh, well, we let people come back," and in my opinion, that's kind of a stupid question because the whole point of Bitcoin is that you can't stop people from coming back. As far as so anyone can come back and submit BIPs or buy Bitcoin. So that's not even like a question to me worth asking. Like, you can't stop someone from coming back in that sense. But do you think we'll see people from maybe these smaller projects that have to do with ABC or SV or anything like that? Do you think anyone will come back, or you think they'll just pride will get in the way?
I think the profit motive will force certain people back. An example of this was Roger Ver diverted a huge fraction of the hashing power that he controls to mining ABC for a while because he wanted to protect that chain, and the SV chain had a lot more hashing power, so he temporarily diverted it, but he was making a huge loss on running his equipment on mining ABC, and so eventually he switched back to mining Bitcoin. And I think the same thing is going to be true of Jihan. I'm not so sure for people like Craig Wright, who to me seems like a complete lunatic. I don't know what will drive him to do whatever he does. It doesn't seem predictable at all. But in general, the people who are rational, I think, will eventually be driven back to Bitcoin if they want to stay in this space. Okay.
Well, anything else on the forks and the fork wars and the hash wars and anything like that?
I could spend hours talking about how ill-conceived the whole thing was, but I think what we've said so far is enough.
How much do you think, let me ask you this real quick. How much, and obviously this is not something that you can actually quantify in terms of energy or time necessarily, but where is that line between refuting bad arguments and realizing that at some point it's a waste of your time and just letting people fade off into irrelevance? Because I don't know, I think there's a certain part that particularly for people like Roger or CSW that's kind of like they only remain relevant because we keep talking back with them.
Yeah, that's an interesting point and relevant to Twitter debates or public debates in general. I see the point of those kind of debates not as a means of trying to convince my opponent, because often the person who you're debating cannot be convinced. They're so entrenched in their opinion that they will never shift. the people you're trying to reach are the onlookers, the people who are open-minded and still don't fully understand what the debate is about, don't understand all the issues, but they're interested in learning more. And so I think there is value in refuting bad arguments and putting forth the best arguments for why people should be interested in Bitcoin. And really, that's why I wrote my article on why I'm bullish about Bitcoin, because I felt like there was so much misinformation and misunderstanding in what Bitcoin was and what money is in general. And so I wanted to write the article for people who were still open-minded, who didn't really understand what Bitcoin was about, and wanted to learn about the economic reasons why it's such a unique and interesting technology.
Very cool. We've got a little bit more time here. Can I ask you a little bit about your time at Google? And I know you kind of talked about this more in detail on Stephen Livera's show, so I you don't have to go into big detail, but can you speak for a minute to kind of like the stuff that went on with the censorship and their partnership with the Chinese government, and then how that might be playing out today?
Yeah, so when I worked at Google, I was an engineer on Google News, and I worked on Google News for I think 3 years. And near the end of my tenure, I was asked to write some code to censor news articles in China, because Google News, they wanted to expand the product offering, so it was offered in several countries around the world. And when it came to China, the Chinese government had a bunch of restrictions on what kind of news you could show to their people. And so if you wanted to launch a product like Google News in China, you had to comply with those rules. And so I was asked to write the rules to censor news articles in China, and I refused. And I said, I feel really uncomfortable doing this. And they took me off the project and put someone else on. And really the reason I was so uncomfortable was I imagined a situation where a journalist in China had the courage to write about some atrocity that occurred in China, and that story showed up on Google News, and then the Chinese government asked us to censor it, and we removed the news article. And then I found out later that something bad happened to that journalist. I wouldn't be able to live with myself. So if anything, it was like my own self-preservation. I wouldn't be able to handle knowing that I had been involved in something like that. And I discovered some emails actually, which gave some more details about what was required in the censorship that I found that were when I was at Google. It was on a mailing list, and the emails were between myself and some colleagues, and we were debating whether the Olympics at the time, which were in China, were a good thing for Chinese democracy or not. And some of the details that came up when I discovered these emails were that Google needed to comply with requests from the Chinese government within 15 minutes. So if the Chinese government said remove this article, it needed to be down in 15 minutes or less. And
Wow.
I'm quite amazed at rediscovering that. The other thing I found a little disturbing discovering those emails is the willingness of my former colleagues to not only comply with the censorship, but their enthusiasm in rationalizing why it was actually a good idea for Google to do it. And it's not a coincidence that the reasoning that they gave was the same reasoning that management had given to the whole company for why we were going into China. And I made this point on Twitter that I think this is a general point, but it applies to politics, but it also applies to the politics of corporations, and that's power creates opinion. When someone in power states an opinion as being the truth, it kind of trickles down to the people below them, and then they start parroting the same rationale. And that's what I saw at Google. Management said, going into China is a good thing because it's going to increase the amount of information that Chinese citizens will have, and that will have a democratizing effect on China, and people will eventually be freer. Actually, there was no evidence that any of that happened. It didn't make China a freer place at all. And I think Google eventually understood this, and Sergey Brin, who's one of the co-founders of Google, eventually pushed for Google to leave China. And I think that was because of his own experience growing up in the Soviet Union. He really had a visceral understanding of what it's like to live under an oppressive regime, and he did not want to comply with China, and the demands from China actually became more onerous over time, and so he reached his breaking point. But the interesting thing now is Google is from news reports is building a search engine for China, is thinking of re-entering, and the CEO Sundar Pichai just went in front of Congress today and denied that they actually had plans to enter China, which I think is nonsense. They devoted significant resources to building a search engine, and Sergey Brin is no longer has a lot of influence at Google. He doesn't have an active part in running the day-to-day of the company as he did back in 2010. So the people who are there now, I think, are much more interested in the profits that they've left on the table by not being in China. And I think this backlash that's happened now that it's been exposed that Google's working on this may cause them to not go ahead with it, because the backlash has been so strong and I think so unexpected that employees at Google who are now threatening to leave the company because of this. So I think management at Google is taking it more seriously, and certainly going in front of Congress and having to answer questions about why Google's censoring or aiding the Chinese government in censoring its citizens, I think is making them think twice.
That's good, I guess. Yeah, man. Wow. Anything else that you want to touch on? I know you're going to have to go soon.
No, I think that was a great discussion, Josh. It was really enjoyable chatting with you.
Well, we will have to do this again sometime. Again, guys, go check out Vijay's article, Bullish Case for Bitcoin. I think it's evergreen. I don't think it's any details in there that were current events at the time are negligible to the main content. So you guys check that out. Vijay, how can we keep up with what you're doing?
You can find me on Twitter, real_Vijay at Twitter. I would like to write more long form articles, but because I have 2 young kids, I unfortunately don't have much time. So I'll occasionally post a tweet storm of something that really should be an article, and so you'll find my thoughts there.
Awesome, very good. That's gonna wrap it up. Vijay, thanks for your time. I really appreciate you coming on.
Thanks, Josh.
All right, bottom shelfers, that's going to do it for our show today. If you're not already following Vijay on Twitter, go follow him. And if you haven't read The Bullish Case for Bitcoin, I've got a link in the show notes. Go check that out. And be sure to read that for sure. And then also I've got a link in there for an article from BitMEX Research that kind of dives more into all the issues with Bitmain and what Vijay was talking about with holding on to so much Bcash and propping up the price that way and all that. So that's a really good read. Go check that out. If you want to support the show, as always, like and share and subscribe and annoy your friends by telling them to listen to the show, and subscribe to the show on iTunes or whatever podcast app you use so you don't miss a single episode. You can follow me on Twitter at BottomshelfBTC. And then if you want to support more directly, more financially, I've got links in the show notes to my Tallycoin page. And if you go to bottomshelfbitcoin.com/donate, there's a link there for my Payname address. And if you're just trying to get rid of your fiat, you can use Patreon. Although I don't know if you guys have been paying attention lately, but Tallycoin may be making Patreon totally obsolete soon. So that's some interesting stuff. I may have to get DJ Booth on here and talk to him about that. He's been doing some really good work there. And then I also have the link on my site for the and actually it should be in the show notes too, for the Tuttle Twins books. go check those books out. They're really great reads for kids or adults, honestly. Just a cool last minute Christmas gift, or maybe if you've missed in time to get it for Christmas, just a gift for a kid you know or for yourself. I have no shame in saying that these books helped me kind of get some basic info before going on and reading the thicker, more adult content versions that they're based on. So go check those out. Great stuff on liberty and free market economics and things like that, but at a very introductory level that's easy to understand, and I get a little kickback when you use my link. So check those out, read those books, buy them for everybody you know, and come back next week. I've got Jeff Vandrew on, and we're going to be talking about his QuickBooks integration to BTC Pay Server, so that's very exciting. From Bottomshelf Bitcoin, I'm Josh Humphrey. Thanks for listening.